Jacob Sharp. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to my reading. First, I'm going to bore you with a brief history lesson, and then I'll reel you back in with the actual reading. So, just to sort of set the stage for what we're going to read here, my book is A Boy Against the Boxers. This follows a young American boy named Eddie Donahue who finds himself in Peking, China in the year 1900. So, the reason he is in Peking, China is colonialism took on a slightly different flavor in China at the turn of the century. Unlike some of the other nations that had, Western colonial powers, China, this is an established dynasty, it's an established empire. They were a little more resistant to a lot of the colonial efforts that you would see in places like Africa, India, post-Mughal empire, stuff like that. And so what you really saw with the colonial influence in China is you saw a lot of trading actions. So you had Western European, American traders, even people from Japan at the time, of course, had a big imperial presence and was attempting to expand their colonial presence around the world. And what they were doing is they were, of course, trying to extract things like silk and other trade goods. And you also had this sort of, multi-pronged element of colonialism that you saw in all colonial efforts, where you would have the trade goods side, you would have a military side, and then you would also have religious outreach. So, Jesuit missionaries, things of that nature. So you're trying to convert the locals to Christianity, extract the trade goods, and then you could do that either by force or by offering force, which is what the Europeans were doing in China in this case. So, they were offering naval power and things of that nature to the Imperial Chinese. And so in Peking, which is modern-day Beijing in the year 1900, there was an international legation quarter, which is where all of these Europeans and the American traders resided. This was essentially a walled compound in the right next to the old city of center of Peking, and many of the buildings they were built in a Western European fashion. It was sort of this extract of Western Europe in the center of Beijing, and the Chinese did not necessarily like the colonial influence that was taking place. So they felt that justifiably so, that they were seeing a great change in how their people were being treated. They did have lots of Christian converts, and they didn't appreciate that. They felt like a lot of their old traditions were going away, and that the Westerners were wielding sort of outsized power. And so a movement came out of that, and this was the Boxer movement. The Boxers were sort of a quasi, supernatural organization that was anti-foreign, and foreign in this context being Western European, and anti-Chinese Christian. And they set about to remove these people from mainland China. And that leads us to the Boxer Rebellion. This is a really interesting part of history because this is one of the last times where we find a lot of these Western European nations fighting alongside each other, because 14 years later, of course, many of them would be fighting against each other in World War I. So this is almost sort of the end of an era when it comes to Western European factions working alongside each other, and these sort of foreign escapades that nations were getting up to. So one thing that the Boxers would do, they were big on having these demonstrations in public where they would do martial arts. They would shoot at each other with blanks in their muskets, and he survived because obviously we're magic. We're invincible, right? Eddie Donahue has a young friend named Jacques. He's the son of a French diplomat, and they decide that they want to go see one of these demonstrations, and their timing is poor. So here we go. This way, I think, said Jacques. The voices were extremely loud now. Eddie could hardly hear himself think in the babble of shouted Mandarin which surrounded him. The pair turned one last corner and found themselves at the entrance to a large open square. At the center of the square stood several hundred locals, their backs to the boys. They pointed and gestured at something which the two could not see, though flashes of light and repetitive thwops and thwacks echoed through the area. "Come, my friend, come. We must climb. We cannot see through the mass from down here." Jacques looked from side to side before finding a stack of discarded crates and baskets which were thrown against a nearby wall. "Come, come," he urged, and charged up the ad hoc staircase, scrambling onto the wall's shingled top. Eddie followed, and before long the two boys were straddling the wall and could see quite plainly over the gathered masses. The entirely Chinese crowd had no foreign interlopers in sight. At its center, several dozen men wore the distinctive white tunics and red sashes of the boxers. All of them carried weapons, a mixture of swords, the curved spears which he'd seen before, and even outdated muskets which he assumed were quite old. All the boxers were kneeling except for a group of 10, and that group faced each other in pairs. At shouted commands, the 10 men charged towards one another and performed very impressive maneuvers. Their feet and weapons moved in a highly choreographed dance which Eddie knew they must have accomplished only through many hours of training and practice. This went on for some time, and the shouts and cheers of the supportive crowd accompanied each slash and charge. At long last, an enormous man held up his arms and strode to the center of the group of performers, who quickly bowed and then, walking backwards with their heads bent, vanished into the crowd. The large man stood for a moment in silence, turning this way and that as he examined the onlookers. Finally, he pointed at random, beckoning a man from the crowd to step forward. The man must be a farmer, Eddie thought, judging by his unadorned, dirty blue robe and wide-brimmed conical straw hat. The man shuffled forward towards the big boxer, who leaned towards him, speaking silently into his ear. The old man's face paled, and he shook his head vigorously from side to side as if appalled by the request. The boxer spoke more, looking insistent, and then, as fast as a striking serpent, grabbed a musket from one of his companions and thrust it into the farmer's outstretched hands. The boxer held his arms upright and walked 10 paces away from the farmer, who looked at the musket in shock. The boxer yelled words which Eddie couldn't understand, and on command the farmer pointed the old gun towards the boxer, and at a second shouted word, pulled the trigger. The gun went off with a loud boom, and the thick smoke from its barrel obscured the large boxer for a moment. The boys sat in silence along with the crowd. Had they just watched a man kill himself by his own orders? Eddie felt the wind blow softly over his neck, and the breeze continued along through the open square, then through the crowd, until finally it blew the cloud of black powder smoke away. As the smoke cleared, Eddie gasped. The big boxer still stood, alive as the day he was born. He raised his arms toward the sky in triumph. The boxer yelled at the top of his lungs, and the farmer looked at the rifle in shock before raising his own voice. The crowd went wild, their yells making the earlier din seem as quiet as a bubbling brook in comparison. Eddie couldn't believe what he'd seen. The farmer, despite his inexperience, stood far too close to the big boxer to have missed him. He just witnessed a man getting shot, and he didn't even blink. Had they witnessed mere trickery, or were these men truly magical? Eddie didn't know the answer, and he didn't think he wanted to either. However, Jocks was a bit too impressed. He yelled and whooped at the display, waving his silly straw hat above his head. The spectacle drew the attention of some of the Chinese who stood on the edges of the crowd, and Eddie felt very uneasy as he watched them shake their neighbors and point. Before long, many dozens of the crowd were looking at the two foreign boys who sat spying on their meeting. Jocks, you need to be quiet. We need to go now. Eddie's voice quickened with urgency, but the silly Parisian paid him no mind. Mon Dieu, did you see that? What magic, what wonder. I do not believe this. The white-jacketed boy's voice trailed off as he noticed the crowd's newfound attention. Oui, but I believe you are right. It was too late. The crowd now wholly focused on the boys. The boxers at their center pushed through the masses towards the wall, and their voices rose in anger. Their weapons were outstretched, and their faces were full of fury. Eddie's stomach sank as he realized not only were they lost in Peking, but that several hundred possibly magical Chinese wanted to kill him. Run! Eddie pushed the frozen Parisian backwards off the wall, away from the square, then jumped after him. The two landed with a crash, and Eddie pulled Jocks to his feet. On the other side of the wall, they could hear the shouts and stomping feet of the crowd who surged towards them. Go, we have to go. They'd found themselves in a small courtyard, likely the backyard of a residence, and they ran through an open gate and turned right onto a winding street which neither boy recognized. All they knew was that they had to go, and fast. The pair broke into a sprint, their legs pumping as they moved through the dirty streets as fast as they could. Eddie had no idea where they were, nor which way they needed to go, and the uproar from the crowd behind them quickly gained ground on the fleeing boys. His heart pounded. Eddie had never been this afraid in his whole life. His legs churned, but they felt as productive as walking through a sea of molasses, and Jocks looked even more tired than he. He dragged the irritating Frenchman by his jacket now and chafed at the extra energy this required. Edward Donahue suddenly realized that they were doomed. His aching legs grew slower by the second. If he'd been alone, perhaps he would have escaped easily. He could have at least outran the crowd and then pieced his way back to the legation quarter, but the slow Parisian foiled that plan. He couldn't leave him behind, though. That way lacked honor, but he thought about it. No, he couldn't do that. A soldier wouldn't leave another soldier behind just because he was slow or hurt. Eddie pulled his friend and ran, and pulled and ran some more, but the voices grew louder. Turning a corner, Eddie noticed the shops and buildings around him seemed even older than the rest of the city and were practically abandoned. The rooftops were very low compared to the newer structures they'd been passing, and he knew if he could get Jocks to help, they could probably make it on top of one. A perfect place to hide. Jocks, kneel down, quick, you have to trust me. Jocks did not trust him, and the Parisian's complaints began afresh in his mother tongue. Eddie pushed him into a kneeling position, and before he could complain again, the American hopped onto the other boy's shoulders and used him as a human staircase. He pulled himself on top of the dilapidated mud brick building and then laid over its edge, reaching both hands out for Jocks. Come on now, he said urgently. Grab my hands and climb. The Frenchman complied, his fear overcoming his naturally contentious nature. Eddie pulled as hard as he could, and Jocks finally found himself beside the panting boy. They hurried in a crouch away from the building's edge and laid flat, daring not to move or breathe any more than absolutely necessary. It wasn't a second too soon. The screaming crowd barreled past the building in hot pursuit, and Eddie could have reached out and grabbed any one of the dozens of viciously curved spearheads which he watched move past him at eye level, their owners completely oblivious to their prey's nearby hiding spot. They waited in silence for a few minutes, but to Eddie those minutes felt like years. The screaming crowd receded into the far distance, and the abandoned streets below him grew quiet. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest, and the two boys lay beside each other for some time before either raised the courage to speak. Jocks finally broke the silence, his voice a cracked whisper. Mon ami, after today I owe you my life. You've saved me from certain death, I think. Eddie watched as a large white cloud passed overhead, obscuring the blazing sun for a moment. Don't mention it. The pair sat quietly for a moment longer before Eddie asked, so do you know where we are? Jock's loud gulp provided all the answer Eddie needed, and he sighed. Me neither. Well, we need to move one way or another. Eddie helped lower Jocks to the street, then hopped down after him. They had a general idea of which direction they'd run, but in their panicked flight from the square, they hadn't paid any attention to where they were going or what landmarks they passed in getting there. Besides, Eddie thought, I was lost before we made it to the square anyways. He didn't want to say anything to Jocks. In fact, he'd prefer it if the Parisian didn't speak at all for a while. So Eddie pressed forward, taking turn after turn on pure instinct. From time to time, they noticed inquisitive eyes peeking out from behind shuttered windows and doors. Upon recognizing foreigners, the eyes quickly vanished back into the darkness of their homes or shops. The pair walked for what must have been miles before Jocks felt rested enough to complain again. You do not know where you are going, is this true? Eddie's forehead grew hot with anger. And what if I don't? This is all your swell idea, Frenchie. Jocks, ever the proud Frenchman, held his ridiculous straw hat to his chest as he received the insult. The two boys continued shouting at one another. Hey, a gruff American voice stopped the boys in their tracks. Will you all be quiet before you get us all killed? The two boys turned towards the source of the speaker. A pale white face shone back at them from a nearby alley. They hurriedly moved into the shadows, and Eddie gasped as he recognized the man. Sergeant John Campbell, the newest American Marine in the legation quarters, sat with his back to the alley's dirty wall. A broken handcart partially concealed the older man, and the boys could easily see that the tall Marine's khaki pant leg had grown dark with blood and hid a serious wound. Pain contorted Campbell's face, and he braced himself with his left arm. His right hand kept a tight grip on his cowboy revolver. Well, what are you two looking at? Y'all gonna help me up or what? So that's the excerpt from the book. Feel free to buy one if you don't have one already. For investment. Thank you.